research and language learning series. This series is co-sponsored by the University of Illinois' Slavic Effort Service, the Russian East European Eurasian Center here in Illinois, and Indiana University's language workshop. This is an online series that features students and established scholars discussing the role language proficiency plays in research with examples from their own scholarly works. I am delighted to welcome our speaker for this event, Professor Darren Byler. He's an assistant professor in the School for International Studies at Simon Fraser University in Canada. Professor Byler's work has appeared in the journals, for example, the Asia Pacific Journal, Contemporary Islam Central Asian Survey, the Journal of Contemporary Chinese Art. He recently published a monograph, Terror, Capitalism, Uyghur Disposition and Masculinity in a Chinese City. This was published by Duke University Press in 2021, among others. I am so delighted to welcome Professor Byler. His presentation title today is Reading the Backstreets in Urumchi as translation as ethnographic method in Northwest China. I should also note that Darren is part of a fantastic project that I've been following with just complete awe and amazement and admiration. This is, of course, the Xinjiang documentation project. The goal of this project is to collect, preserve, assess, and make available documentary information on the extrajudicial detention of Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and other ethnic groups in Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region in northwestern China. Darren, I'm so glad you're here. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Joe, and thank you all for coming. It's a real honor to be here. I was happy to receive some guiding questions from the organizers of today's event, so I structured my talk around those questions, which really have to do with language proficiency and how it coincides with research, and as an ethnographer, how it allowed me to enter into the Uyghur world, or at least to become a participant observer of it. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen, and oh, I did the wrong thing again here. Sorry. I'm going to share my screen, and we'll talk about a novel that I translated as part of my ethnographic work, a novel called The Backstreets. So Joe mentioned that I published an ethnography, which is this. I also published a short book called In the Camps, which is a more narrative nonfiction book published through a press that's associated with the Columbia Journalism School. And then this novel, which is what I'll be talking about. And, these three projects are interlinked. One of them is about the lead up to the camp system. That's the ethnography. The other one is about what it's like to live inside that camp system and to be able to escape it. And then the third is the novel, which is about what this looks like, what the process of the buildup of all of this looks like from a Uyghur perspective. So I got started going to the Uyghur region back in 2003 when I was an undergraduate student. Was still sort of figuring out what I wanted to do with my life. I'm from Ohio. I grew up in a small town, and so kind of traveling the world as a photojournalist, which is what I was studying as an undergrad, was really exposing me to multiple ways of understanding the world and its future. And I went to Xinjiang at that point as a photographer, and was just sort of taken by the way life proceeded in public, which is something I could document as a photographer, but also how it was pulling on this long tradition of what it means to be Uyghur, what it means to be attached to the land, to the space where the ancestors of Uyghurs are from. And as I began to study Chinese and then later Uyghur language, I became aware of the ethno-linguistic diversity of China, which you see outlined here in this map. You see that this darker green area is the historical homelands of the Han people, which is a majority group of China. But then there's all these other groups, especially down in Southwest China, smaller groups like the Miao and the Yi and others. And then there's the Tibetans, which many of us are familiar with, and the Mongol peoples. And then the Turkic Muslims are up here. And so recognizing that what we take to be China, which is a kind of Han-dominated space of 1.3 billion Han people, is not represented in terms of, is not very representative of the historical homelands of these different groups. The Uyghur region is an immense space. It's the size of all of Southwest America, from California to New Mexico, Utah, Nevada, and everything in between. It's a large space, and it's really only become incorporated into China over the last 70 years or so. I mean, prior to this, there was a Chinese presence. It had been claimed by Chinese military officials, but there wasn't a sort of occupying presence of settlers, of people from other parts of China who had moved there. And so as I started my research in 2003, I was looking at a government program called Open Up the West, which was about integrating the periphery, all the dark purple areas you see here, with the Han majority areas, with the sort of the center of the economy, which is really on the eastern seaboard. And this was the case because of China's turn towards the West after the Maoist period, after Mao died, and the opening and reform period that was initiated by Deng Xiaoping. That's why the Eastern Seaboard became a driver of the economy, because this is the center of manufacturing. That's when made in China products began to appear in the 1990s. To drive that economy, they needed to access natural resources such as oil and natural gas. And so in the 90s and more so in the 2000s, what I was observing was lots and lots of people moving from other parts of the country to build the infrastructure, the roads and the pipelines, and then eventually to develop industrial scale agriculture. Today, around 85% of Chinese cotton comes from this region. It's about 20% of the world's supply of cotton. And 20% of Chinese oil and natural gas comes from this region. Lots and lots of oil and natural gas is coming from Central Asia as well. And so Xinjiang, the Uyghur region, is seen as a core zone of China's Belt and Road Initiative, and just an important part of the Chinese economy in general. But as I was starting my research, this was just happening. People were just arriving, and development in terms of the infrastructure and the urban planning of Uyghur majority spaces was just starting to take form. And so it seemed like a really interesting thing to study. And so I started to cast about for places to learn the language, to learn more about who are the Uyghurs. And some of what I found was texts such as this book by Ryan Thum, which is showing how Uyghurs narrate their history by associating with shrines of the bringers of Islam, the people who brought Islam to the Uyghurs over a millennium ago, where there's also forms of animistic practice of thinking about the space itself as sacred, that pull on a deeper history beyond even the history of Islam, to the history of what it means to be Uyghur, sort of trans-historically. And so Uyghurs will go to these shrines on a regular basis. And as they're visiting the shrines, the sort of keepers of the shrines will narrate the history of the people that are said to be buried in these places. And that really is what shapes the Uyghur conceptualization of history. It's the oral tradition of telling these stories over and over again. Sometimes there's a text that's associated with it, but a lot of it is the people who are in charge of these shrines sort of telling the stories. What I was seeing in the 2000s and then in the 2010s was the ways in which Uyghurs were being removed from the land, the way that they were being forced to demolish their properties, their housing, how they were being moved into government planned sort of housing on the peripheries of their their old oasis cities, and also how they're being pushed from rural areas into urban ones. So I was really tracking the way that migrants were going from rural areas to the city. And these are young men who are the children of farmers who can't find a future working on the farm because the cost of living is starting to rise due to all of the new settlers who are moved into the Uyghur majority areas. And so they're going to the city to try to find work, forms of day labor, the service economy, and also to find greater forms of freedom. So 2011, which is when I started my fieldwork, was also the first moment when 3G networks were introduced in the region. And so for the first time, people were starting to use internet and smartphones, and they were beginning to pull on sort of global piety networks. They were learning about Islam via their smartphones. And so I was seeing this real increase in Islamic piety among Uyghurs. Some of this was in reaction to the settler populations and the state policies that were trying to constrain Islamic practice and Uyghur understandings of history. It was during the same period, the state was also banning the practice of going to these shrines that I just mentioned in a moment ago. And so I was interested in how people were using the internet, how they were trying to build a future in the city, despite all of this. And that, they were publishing their own things online as a way of sort of building their public persona. So young migrant, like this young man, Hassan, who I write about in one of my books, he would publish something on his WeChat wall on a daily basis, often something related to Islam and sort of depicting his Islamic practice. And so here you see language being used in an interesting way. They were using Uyghur script, which is an Arabic script. They were using voice memos as well to talk about things that the state was trying to control and couldn't fully control, because the state really didn't have the capacity to control Uyghur speech. They couldn't detect what people were saying. They didn't have the censorship equipment. But over time, part of what I'm studying in my work is how they developed those tools to automate detection of Uyghur speech, and then to begin to predict who is potentially an extremist or terrorist, which is how they ended up putting people in camps. By 2017, they had begun to assess the entire population of Uyghurs, which is 12 million people, using categories such as these, the 10 categories, which have to do with the person's age, their ethnicity, their employment status, their religious practice. The number 5, 6, and 10 are about, does this person pray regularly? Do they have religious knowledge? Which means, have they studied the Quran? Have they been part of a study group on WeChat? Have they been someone like Hassan, who, is here, who's reading hadiths or, sayings of the Prophet and then publishing them? And so they're really beginning to assess people's religious behavior, how they're using language, how they're talking about history and politics. They're also looking at people's social networks. Do they have connections abroad? Have they traveled abroad? All of those sorts of things. So a lot of this was like human intelligence, where they're doing interviews with people, they're assessing them. The way that this chart works is you have 100 points, and for each of these categories that apply to the person, they're deducted 10 points, and they move from trustworthy to normal to untrustworthy. So many people were determined to be untrustworthy through these kinds of assessments. Some of it was done, as I said, through face-to-face interactions. A lot of it was done through automated surveillance of people's digital history, looking at what they had said online and so on. Another thing that they were doing at the same time was they were looking at cultural leaders, people who were sort of shaping Uyghur sociality by their position within it. And so many of these people were Communist Party members who were working in government institutions like schools or universities, and were shaping the Uyghur language curriculum within Uyghur language schools. They were editors, they were authors. And one of those authors was this man, Perhat Tursun, who was a friend of mine, is a friend of mine. He's still alive, and is the author of the novel The Backstreets, which I'll talk about in a minute. I was drawn to this. Well, I'll save that for a second. Perhat Tursun is a poet. He's an author. He's a public intellectual. He's born in southern Xinjiang in 1969. He was one of the first cohorts of Uyghurs who received training in Beijing in the 1990s, 80s and 90s. Eventually, he ended up getting a PhD in Turkology and sort of literary studies. As he tells his biography, he said he learned Chinese in order to read world literature and philosophy. And I believe him when he says this, because he and many other Uyghurs said the same, that because Uyghur language literature was, there was limited availability in terms of what they could find in their own language, many Uyghurs intellectuals learn Chinese in order to access other kinds of information that was translated into Chinese, because Chinese is a much larger has a much larger sort of publishing presence. So that's why Perhat Tursun got started in studying Chinese and then wanting to push the boundaries of Uyghur language publishing. So he was learning Chinese, so study the world, study philosophy, and then he started publishing his own work. His first novel was called The Art of Suicide, and it was viewed as really controversial within the Uyghur milieu. It was seen as too critical of religion, of Islam, and too explicit in its discussion of sexuality and mental illness. He's really writing in dialogue with modernist poets and modernist fiction writers. He's reading Nietzsche. He's reading, the same kinds of people that many of us have read, as we're beginning an intellectual journey. But over time, he despite him being sort of censored by other Uyghurs and by the state, he becomes a leader of a generation of Uyghur writers and poets and translators. And so I was, as I was trying to understand sort of the deeper history of who Uyghurs are, I was drawn to his work, and in particular to this one book. Perhat was disappeared in January 2018, and from what we know, based on the evidence that we've been able to find, I was there in 2018 as well and asked people in the bookshops about him, and they confirmed as well that he had been taken. But from what we know, he was sentenced to 16 years in prison. It's not completely clear what the charges are, but it may have something to do with his signing of a petition to protect Uyghur language. In general, though, he's one of 400 or more Uyghur intellectuals who were taken at this time, people who were seen as not fully embracing the state's message as to how Uyghurs should assimilate into the Chinese population. So, it's safe to say that one of the most likely the primary reason why he was taken was simply his status within Uyghur society. So as I was getting started with my research, I was wanting to understand why and how I can make sense of a Uyghur world. Why to make sense of it, how to make sense of it. And I was doing all of these interviews with people. I'd studied Uyghur at the University of Washington and had a fairly decent proficiency in it. But it's one thing to kind of read the texts, and it's another thing to actually see how the texts are lived or how they're experienced by people who are living within that world. And so I was searching for stories that would help to sort of narrate the deeper history, the deeper sort of feeling of kind of a structure of feeling, to kind of go to Raymond Williams' work, that Uyghurs feel within this system. And so I was really drawn to a strain of anthropology that takes some guidance from phenomenology and from existentialist sort of traditions in philosophy, the same sorts of things that Parhat Tursun is actually drawn to. And the way it tries to understand a life world and the shape, like how narratives begin to shape life, how they respond to life, how they allow someone who's telling their story to recreate a world, restoring, and as that's happening, to restores agency to the teller. And so I was reading this work from Michael D. Jackson, who's not the other Michael Jackson, an anthropologist he's now at Harvard, and the way that he was narrating his own ethnographic work, looking at it in a sort of a literary mode. I was also, of course, like many of us, had read Benedict Anderson's work on the way that communities are imagined through text, how text can stage something for a broader public, and like why people identify with a certain narrative or reject it, like in Parhat Tursun's first book, how it speaks to a certain sort of current within a social milieu. I was also interested in poetics and how poetry strives to represent things that are ineffable, that are really hard to represent. Poetry is trying to understand things that resist symbolization. You can't really hardly put them in language. They're feelings, they're images. And Uyghurs in general are poets. Like they're really, that is their primary literary or cultural mode of production is poetry. Almost everyone can recite poetry. And a lot of it's inflected by sort of Sufi traditions within Uyghur society. And so I was meeting all of these poets, and then I was engaging with Parhat's work, and I was seeing how there's this kind of work happening, that there's something that's evoking a higher truth that I wanted to try to tap into. And as part of my training in post-colonial literature, I was also influenced by an idea of deep cultural learning, how learning a language allows you to access not only sort of the sort of technical equivalence of knowledge, but also the emotional life of that language, the epistemic, the knowledge system that undergirds the language. And so those are all of the reasons why I was wanting to think about literature. And as I was starting my project, I was engaging with another scholar, a friend of mine, who was also interested in literature, a Uyghur friend, and we co-translated a short story and published it in Guernica. And it helped me to begin to do the work of thinking about emotional equivalence between language, and also just the power of Uyghur fiction. And so all of that is what alerted me to thinking about Parhat's work, or being on the outlook for work that would speak to the broader research that I was wanting to do. And so as I was starting my work, I met a friend at this arts institute where I'd gotten affiliation, and where I was taking some advanced Uyghur classes. And he introduced me to this book called The Backstreets, which is really the first part of a larger series of novels called The Big City. And it's about Uyghur migrant experiences in encountering Chinese institutions in the city. So it's really directly about the research that I was trying to do, why and how Uyghurs are moving through the urban spaces, and how they're finding a life within those spaces. Part of why I turned to this novel was also had to do with access, that I couldn't go to rural areas. I couldn't go to the villages in a very free manner, at least, and see how people were living because of the police presence, because there was so much surveillance. And as a foreigner, I would implicate Uyghurs, put them in a dangerous position. And so, a novel is a way to kind of access some of the things that you would hear from someone in a village, but through the voice of someone who's already thinking sort of in a reflective way about what village life is like and why people want to leave and what they encounter in the city. So that's part of how I ended up in reading this novel and thinking with it. there's also there's few places where you can, where Uyghur language learning is supported, where it's really safe to engage with Uyghur language. There's it's one of the most heavily policed language environments, at least in China and maybe in the world. And so engaging Uyghur speakers in their own homeland was something I had to think through. So I want to read you just a little bit of a short piece I wrote for Words Without Borders as I was publishing the novel. It comes from my ethnography, Terror Capitalism, where I'm just sort of evoking what it's like to try to work with Uyghur language in the Uyghur space. Okay, it's just a short piece. The man was sitting 3 tables away from us, dressed in a black jacket and a striped polo shirt. He looked like an average middle-aged Uyghur man. He seemed to be talking intently on his smartphone. Over small glasses of Turkish tea, A and I were reading and translating a Uyghur novel called The Backstreets. We had been meeting this way each morning for several weeks. The problem was that the same man had been sitting 3 tables away from us the day before. 2 days in a row seemed like too much. I whispered to A, who had his back to the man, "I think that guy might be following us." I nodded at the man with a tilt of my head. He was in the same spot yesterday. I might just be paranoid, but I think he might be taking pictures while he pretends to talk on his phone. A's face went white. He lurched to his feet. We took off, walking in different directions, trying to see if anyone was following us. Back in 2014, facial recognition cameras and checkpoints had not yet been installed across the city, so tracking people in space required human intelligence. We deleted WeChat from our phones in case we were detained and forced to show the Ministry of State Security agents our contacts and our chat history. But there was not much we could do to delete the text messages on our smartphones. And we knew that Tencent and China Mobile could always share our information with the MSS if they were really serious about investigating us. Several hours, I texted A to see if he spotted anything unusual. Nothing. After waiting a day, we started meeting again, relieved that it might be a coincidence. We smoked our cheap Hong He cigarettes and laughed at our paranoia. We went back to our tea in our corner of the tea house, quietly translating our novel, the first long-form work of Uyghur fiction, to appear in English. Translating the novel helped A to think about his own life, his upbringing in a village that was slowly overrun by Han settlers, and the way the promise of education and economic development was withheld by racialized institutions that slotted him into token positions at best and repelled him like unwanted vermin at worst. Though he had found a way to pursue his obsession, chemistry, after leaving college, A's work at a chemical factory and then as a science teacher was undermined by the way his coworkers and students smirked at his accented Mandarin and mocked his hair and his mannerisms. He felt that everywhere he turned, he was asked, "What are you doing here?" This is why he had stuck to the ghettoized Uyghur enclaves of the city, hiding from the Chinese gaze. We met in the tea shop to do the translation because an American anthropologist like me meeting an underemployed Uyghur with fidgety hands like A in either of our apartments might raise suspicion with the Civil Affairs Ministry personnel who installed QR codes on every apartment door. They scanned the codes every few days, which pulled up high-resolution images and digital records of registered inhabitants with their smartphones and conducted surprise inspections of Muslim homes looking for unregistered people. So it was better to do the translation out in the open, taking advantage of the vibrant tea culture that Uyghurs share with peoples throughout Western and South Asia. We tried to reassure ourselves that we did not have anything to hide. The only thing we were doing was making an all too common Uyghur story of systematic discrimination accessible to an English reading world. But we knew even this act of translating an everyday reality was transgressive, and this shared knowledge, along with the rhythm we developed as co-translators, built an intimacy between us. Translating the Backstreets with A was intense. It meant poring over complex grammatical structures and odd turns of phrase, trying to get at the motive equivalence of each line. But more than the literal meaning of the words, it taught me about a rich knowledge system and world of experience that shapes Uyghur life, things that were impossible for me to learn in a college classroom. It guided me to a whole new set of questions to ask dozens of young Uyghurs I interviewed about their past and their imagined futures as part of my ethnographic research. Most importantly, it showed me what it means to be a friend and to sit next to the pain and loneliness of someone in the midst of deep, intractable depression. Reading the text together allowed me to dwell on A's rage. It showed me how the trauma of colonization seeps into the all aspects of life. It shapes individuals' possibilities, their life paths. It does not erase their agency or their ability to narrate their own story, but I found that colonialism narrows it. When I left the region in 2015, I promised Perhat Tursun and A that I would find a publisher for the novel, but instead I waited. I wanted to make sure that the media attention the publication would bring wouldn't cause undue harm to either of them. In 2017, A reached out to tell me he couldn't remain in direct contact with me and other foreigners as he had before. Several months later, another friend from his village told me that he had been taken to a camp near his home village in southern Xinjiang, far from the city. Around the same time, I heard the news that Perhat Tursun had disappeared as well. So that's a bit of the context of what it means to use Uyghur language within the Uyghur space, the stakes, the political stakes, and the ethical stakes of doing it, the imperative to do it, but also the risk. And this is a story that's personal to me, that is speaking to a moment in my life that is ongoing, but where I was sitting knee to knee with someone who's now in a camp, but also someone who was experiencing the plot of the story we were translating. So the Backstreets, the novel, is about a young man who's trying to find a place to sleep in the city, who's trying to rent an apartment and is not able to. It's a rural migrant who's fleeing poverty and abuse, abuse that is exacerbated by the presence of these people that have moved into their village and into their community. It's also about the promise of a better life that can be found through hard work and through education. A promise that for A, my co-translator, and for the protagonist of the novel, turns out to be a false promise. It's a story about a temporary worker in a government office. He's like an intern, and how he's negotiating the office politics of having a Han boss who's like looking over his shoulder all the time, and janitors in the building who are criticizing him because he doesn't speak Chinese as well as they do. It's a story also about what it's like to live in a city where the ground of truth is filtered through a state apparatus. And so it's really hard to know kind of the past or the future, what that looks like. And so there's a lot of discussion of smog or fog in the city that makes it we're negotiating space and how to move through space that itself is a challenge. It's also a novel that focuses on confronting hatred between the colonized and the colonizer. So one of the moments in the book where that is most heightened is this one moment where Perhat has written this wall of chops that are meant to interrupt the reader as they're moving through the text over 200 times. The people are having their heads chopped off by someone who maybe has some form of mental illness, but is also articulating the kind of rage that confronts Uyghurs, the sort of hatred that Uyghurs are faced with, a kind of genocidal rage. And he's making it clear as he's so he says in the novel that that every time he says this chop, he's saying pi, which is not the Uyghur word for chop, it's the Mandarin word for chop. So he's making it clear in an indirect way that this is not a Uyghur person talking about other Uyghurs. This is a Han person talking about Uyghurs. And then he gets into sort of an absurdist frame of mind to kind of think about like, what would that actually mean to chop off the heads of all 12 million people in southern Xinjiang, the 6 cities, which is the historic oasis cities of the Uyghurs. So this is the sort of, just to give you a sense of the language of the novel, this is how Parhat is framing, even working within the censorship gaze. He's probably going too far by saying this, but he's trying to evoke what it feels like as a Uyghur person to know that you're an unwanted person. So what the novel helped me to do is I could read it on my own, but reading it together with my friend Anonymous, the two of us reading together, really gave me a way of thinking in a much deeper way about a text. Because I think I would have got most of it by just reading it on my own, but reading it together, and then unpacking each paragraph, each sentence together. That act of reading really helped me to think within the Uyghur framework, and my friend Anonymous, like he could, I would say, I understand what this is saying, but does this resonate with you? Is this a similar? Have you had the same experience? And so thinking with him allowed us to get at discussions of things of like the feeling that development, like the infrastructure development that the state says is a gift to the Uyghurs, is really unwanted and is asking them to pull them into a kind of obligation to the state, and also how Uyghurs are being framed as ungrateful because they don't want this gift, the gift of colonialism. Many of the scenes in the novel that are about sort of confronting the ethnic hatred, and sort of blank stares, like when a Uyghur is standing in a store and the proprietor of the store just ignores them and won't do business with them. The ways in which Uyghurs are confronted with racialized slurs, the way they're herded by the police. Those are the things that my friend was telling me is, this is the truth of my experience as well. It's not just, this isn't just a fictional thing. It is fiction, but it's representative of a feeling that I've experienced it myself, that I'm always already the one who's going to be chopped, because of who I am as a person. This is another moment in the novel where he talks about how I used to like smiley face people before I started working in the office. But then I saw enough of that. Sorry, I have to move this over. Saw that smiling boss and began to hate smiling faces. This is because his smiles were always so maddeningly cruel and hateful. In his view, this is the boss, he was a famous artist who was accomplishing great things. Talking to me was not just a waste of his own time, it was actually the crime of wasting the time of his entire ethnic nationality. Even at that moment when he was exploding with anger, he didn't lose the pleasant expression on his face. He asked me over and over again to tell me what I had the ability to do. I repeated the sentence again and again. He repeated the sentence again and again. I told him I had the ability to live. That's right. The greatest thing in the world is living. There's nothing greater than living. What outraged him the most was that I was alive. Therefore, my ability to live must be of great value. My existence itself was the greatest source of frustration for him. Now, this is a moment in the novel, a kind of pivotal moment where the protagonist, this Uyghur young man, is expressing his resistance by the fact of his existence to the colonial project. And this is a moment that really resonated with my colleague as we were translating the novel, a way of articulating something that was hard for him to say or to pin down, that staying alive and continuing to live was in itself an act of resistance. So just to sum up, what this project, my work in general, does and how it's related to sort of language proficiency. knowing Chinese, knowing Uyghur, knowing those two languages together allowed me to see them in tension with each other, the speakers of those languages in tension with each other, and also allowed me to access a sort of deeper world beyond the surface that you might just see as you're going about your day. It allowed me to think in dialogue, as I started to read Uyghur literature, with other stories of colonization, with urban Indian fiction in the North American context, with practices of refusal that speak to that kind of existentialist frame of resistance is just existing. And also racialized history. So, Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison is a major influence on Parhat, that and The Life and Times of Michael Kay by J.M. Coetzee. Those, what does it mean to encounter as a racialized person, the gaze of the state, the gaze of the colonizer? It's also thinking about migration histories, and the Great Migration in the U.S. I think speaks to what I'm observing in the novel. In general, what I see through Uyghur literary production is a refusing to be silenced, a refusing to have their existence eliminated. This novel, I think, will stand up over time as a statement to who Uyghurs are and were, and what their future looks like. The novel does more than that too. It's also describing and showing what the dispossession of their life way looks like. It's showing what domination, which is an institutionalized process, looks like and feels like, and it's evoking what it's like to live in this space and not forget what came before. And so it's demanding recognition from readers, from scholars like me, and it allows us to think about new kinds of solidarity. I think that's what language can do, proficiency can do. And it also allows us to decenter sort of dominant positions within language and literature, which are English and European language-based sort of knowledge production, and think from the margins about how world literature can be reframed by people on the margins. And so, for people that are thinking about learning Uyghur, learning languages that are not taught as much as they should be, I think you should definitely go for it and think about the language you're learning as a resource for pushing back against dominant forms of knowledge production, as a decolonial tool. And so to get really practical, there are places where you can study Uyghur. You can go to, they offer this at Harvard and also at George Washington University, and occasionally at Wisconsin University of Wisconsin. There's ways you can learn it. You have to really seek it out and want to, but I think it's worth the effort. I think it's also important to learn sort of the dominant language within that space. So if you're wanting to do work in relation to Uyghurs, you should probably also learn Chinese. If you're wanting to do work in Central Asia, you might want to learn Russian. These languages are now in tension with each other. They don't exist in isolation. And so knowledge will be richer if you can do that. That's all I have prepared to share with you. I'm looking forward to any thoughts, discussion you might have.
Well, thank you so much, Darren. We're going to open for question and answer now. So if anyone has a question, please feel free to either write it in the chat or just unmute yourself and ask. And we do have some pre-submitted questions, so I can start us off with one of those. I think this question relates well to what you were just talking about at the end of your talk. But someone's asked about if they're studying Uyghurs in diaspora communities, for example, in Turkey or in Central Asia, learning and using a language such as Russian or Turkish that might be spoken in that specific Uyghur community compared to speaking and learning Uyghur. Do you have any thoughts on how research might be different depending on which language you choose to use in those contexts.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, none of this is static, and it really depends on the location where you're working and also the period of time that you're working in. So, if I was doing my research 30 years ago, like Uyghur language in itself would probably would have given me a way into the Uyghur world in a way that now, as Chinese is beginning to dominate Uyghur life, it would do it to a lesser degree. But so certainly, yeah, if you're going to work with Uyghurs in Istanbul or in Germany, learning the language that they're interacting with is a useful thing. And the good thing is that Uyghur and Turkish are not completely dissimilar. They're like maybe 60% the same or something. So the grammar structures are quite similar. But I think you do want to put in the effort to learn Uyghur as well, and because that's the language that people use in their daily life. Even if they're living in Istanbul, like most Uyghurs are living in a Uyghur world, and so if you want to really kind of understand how they're thinking about themselves in the future, how they're understanding their past, Uyghur language proficiency is a really important thing. Just to kind of get into that sort of deeper mindset of how people think, and the knowledge system that they're drawing on.
Thank you. And
oh, sorry. First, I wanted to say they also teach Uyghur at IU, Indiana University.
Oh, good.
And second, can you talk about too, like, this book that you translated, if one of us wanted to go about translating a Uyghur work of literature, how do we kind of choose what would be of the most benefit to English readers, or like what would be of the most demand to English readers, if that makes sense?
Yeah. Well, there's Uyghur literature is actually quite rich, and there's a bunch of different kinds of things you can look at. And there's not much that's been translated. Like this is the very first novel that's been translated, and there's dozens of other novels that could be translated as well. I chose this one because it spoke so directly to my own research, and because I think it speaks to the current moment most directly. But there's other novels that are comedic novels that are looking at Uyghur life in the 1990s and 2000s, where the political stakes are not quite as raised, that I think still get at a lot of the richness of Uyghur life, and I see a lot of value there too. But I have probably 5 or 6 other novels that I'm hoping to translate at some point. So if you want to take one of those off of my list, that would be great, because it does take time to engage with these things, and it's not funded as well as it should be. And so finding the time and the space to do it is a challenge. But I suppose, like, being accountable to the Uyghur community, asking people in the Uyghur community what do they want to see translated, and maybe even working with a Uyghur colleague to do it. I think that's a beneficial thing. I know it's collaborative work is not as well recognized within the American Academy, but I think it's actually quite valuable, because it's about thinking about who's authorized to speak for themselves, and ways that you can come alongside others and support them, as they're wanting to also produce knowledge. So anyway, those are some thoughts.
Hello, thank you so much for this talk. It's quite enlightening and very interesting. So I have a question about this. Let's say the Farhad Tursun's repertoire, like the what he read. Like you mentioned about this, the Western works through, let's say Western, written in the West, and then I mean, like the in terms of like speaking to the power, like as they can like marginalized the group, a member of a marginalized group, like I mean, like do you also like the sense in addition to this, the Western works, like for example, the Sufis, like calendars, because I'm like among Islamic side, I'm like we have like the long history of that kind of like the people, marginalized people writing and then speaking about this power, and then, right, especially the calendars. I mean, like at least I guess maybe very recently, this calendar, this tradition also like has been like very popular among the Uyghurs. Like, do you sense like any like the Farhad Tursun using that kind of like arguments to frame his ideas, his discourses, like about being marginalization, like that kind of stuff? And then like that another question. Sorry. So where do you like get access to this the Uyghur version of this work? I'm like I tried to find it on the website, like the Uyghur language, like the website, but I couldn't find it.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah, those are good questions. So yeah, sure. I mean, he's trained as a Turkologist, so you know, he's definitely influenced by the Sufi poets, Mesrep and others, like who are doing the kind of things that you're saying, where they're speaking back to power. You know, if you see that even more so in his poetry, where he's kind of using the same sorts of framing and in evoking some of those Sufi poets. And it's there in his novels as well, to some extent. He's writing in a modernist style, like as a novelist, like he's writing in relation to Camus, to Kafka, to James Joyce, and to the others that I mentioned. So he's doing both, I think, at the same time, and we don't have to think about them as like either or, like they are both happening at the same time. Part of the reason why, you know, I mentioned the Turkic influences a bit in my introduction to the novel, but I'm also like trying to really engage the broader public who isn't that familiar with that, and to point out some of the other influences. I mean, I stress them a bit more, I suppose, in the introduction, but there's another introduction that could be written that would, you know, situate it more directly and almost only in like Uyghur Turkic traditions, because they're also there. So yeah, maybe you can write that. That would be great. In terms of like getting access to it, it might be on like something like Al-Khatab, the like Uyghur archive. But if it's not, you can find it online, I think, or I could share it with you directly if you just email me. He edited it as we were translating it. So the version that is most closest to the English version may not be in wide circulation. I could share it with you. Yeah, just, you know, feel free to reach out.
Thank you so much.
And I think we have time if there's one last question. And if not, I do have one more question that was submitted ahead of time. So this question was, I think, maybe speaking to the current generation of students who probably can't do any kind of traditional study abroad or travel to Xinjiang. How would you suggest people maybe frame their research projects and go about language learning when that key piece of human interaction might be limited?
Yeah, I mean, it is a challenge. So, you know, I studied Uyghur in the university at University of Washington for a couple of years and got a certain level of proficiency that way. But it wasn't really until I was living in the region and using it in my daily life that I felt like I could, you know, sort of express any idea I wanted in the language, and understand almost everything people were saying. So, like, you know, you really have to be immersed in it, I think, to be able to use it. reading novels and things like I just mentioned, like that can get you some access to things that are harder to access through daily interaction. But the daily, interaction is a really important part. So I think you should plan to go to Istanbul, where there's like, Uyghur Mahalla, like a neighborhood where you can conduct most of your life in Uyghur language. That would probably be the one space in the world where you can do it. So yeah, I would do that, plan to do that. It's great to see that, universities like Indiana University and others are still offering the classes, so you can get a really good base in those places. But yeah, you need to also be able to use it in your life. For me, like developing friendships with people as I was translating work or writing together, like with Mutalib Anwar, who's now teaching at Stanford, and then my co-translator, like that was actually the best like language learning experience that I've ever had, because it's like you become really immersed in it in a daily practice, and it's just using it over and over, and you're really comfortable with each other because you have that kind of intimacy. And so, through those kinds of daily interactions of producing something together, you can really begin to learn the language in a deeper way. So yeah, go translate something together with someone. There's people that really want to do that kind of work too. So, it's not, just an extractive practice. It's actually something that you're co-producing knowledge.
Well, thank you again, Darren, for a wonderful talk. And thank you to our audience for your questions and attention today. This was our last iteration of the Research and Language Learning series for the year, but we will be starting back up again with other languages in the fall. So please do keep in touch, and we'll be announcing those through our social media. Finally, previous talks are on YouTube if anyone is interested in the Kazakh and Uzbek talks. And now I will pass it back to Joe Linkert.
Well, once again, it's not every day that we get to have someone like Darren talk about the way that he works with not only the language that he has specialized, but also the sources and the scholarly process. So once again, Darren, thank you so much, and I hope we can collaborate, because I think you're absolutely right. I think this requires a collective effort on behalf of everybody in the field to not only document but also share the information. I think this is the key, and you're doing it, and we really admire your work. So thank you so much, Darren.
Well, thank you so much. It was great to meet you all.